really fortunate today to have Dr. Andrew Parker come and talk to us. And the intent of all of these talks is really to make this a more secure place to work in. And part of it is knowing when you should, is first of all, making the building safer, training people to recognize risk, and then to know what to do if there's anything that gives you concern about safety. And depending what it is, there are a lot of places to report it, but most of all, not to ignore it. I think as most people know, there's a difference between risk management, between a risk assessment, like violence risk assessment and threat management. So violence risk assessment is where you want to see if the person poses a risk. And then threat management is after there is a threat or you experience something that's threatening, what to do about it. So they're two very separate sorts of things. So Dr. Andrew Parker is a clinical psychologist who serves as manager of the Faculty Staff Assistance Program at UCSF. He's in private practice in San Francisco and Mill Valley. Prior to his career as a psychologist, he was a professional mediator in the field of catastrophic injury litigation. He earned his doctorate from the University of Colorado at Boulder, interned at the San Francisco VA Hospital. And in addition to his private practice, he's worked as a therapist for the San Francisco Vet Center, treating Vietnam combat veterans, and is clinical director from the Swords to Plowshares residential treatment program for homeless vets with PTSD, with long-term addiction. And before coming to UCSF, he was program director for the Old Hawk outpatient program in Marin County, which provides treatment for individuals and families dealing with chemical dependency and eating disorders. At UCSF, which is what we're most interested in right now, he's leader of the threat management team, also serves on the Physicians Wellbeing Committee, the Critical Incident Response Team at San Francisco General, and the Coordinated Community Review Team for Sexual and Gender-Based Violence and Misconduct. And I have to say, I've worked with Dr. Parker for a long time, and through the years, people have contacted me, they're a staff member or a resident or faculty member, that they're just very concerned about what's happening. And I advise them to get in touch with Dr. Parker. Dr. Parker is amazing because he's kind of available 24/7 and just talks them through about, first of all, how serious this threat is, and then what they can do to make them feel safer. And I've gotten incredible positive feedback about having Dr. Parker as a resource here to help people. So thank you.
Thank you. Hi everybody. Pardon me if I sit a fair bit during this. From what Renee and Dominic have told me, that we have some of a mixed group here today. So I understand we have some clinicians, is that right?
Yeah.
And then we also have staff members. We have a mixed group. So I want to try to aim my remarks to be as useful as possible. But if I miss the mark, please stop, ask questions. I'd really much rather this be interactive than just be standing if you're lecturing. So please feel free to interrupt, ask questions, give examples, things like that. So what I'm going to start with is try to put this whole notion of threat assessment, threat management into a larger context, because we're really talking about a continuum of problematic behavior, right? With violence and threats of violence being at the extreme end of that continuum and the least frequent, but again, of course, the most highly impactful. So when we think about this, one of the things that often comes up on the threat management team is a case comes to our attention, and the question is, well, where does it fall in that continuum? Is it really a threat case? Or is it something that might fall just below that, still need to be dealt with on its own terms, and so on. So briefly, And by the way, I'm not going to bore you with reading my slides. You can read as well as I can. But I will, certainly be highlighting the things that I think are particularly important and worth commenting on. But stop and ask me any questions if there's things on the screen that you see that I don't address directly. So, can you read that okay? Mm-hmm. Okay? All right. So the first thing then is to understand what is this cluster of behaviors that falls just short of violence in the workplace cases. These are cases, in other words, where someone's behavior is creating what we would call a hostile work environment. Now that can be very specifically about gender, ethnicity, or other protected classes, but it can also take the broader form of someone who is just an all-purpose harasser, a bully, someone who throws their weight around. It can also include things like stalking cases, and so on. So we need to be clear that, there we go. We need to be clear that there are a lot of very problematic ways people can behave in the workplace that are serious, that do need to be addressed, but that are not threat management cases. Right? And so these include, some of the things mentioned here, verbal abuse, someone who's chronically angry, people walking around on eggshells around them, people who abuse their authority, things like that. In fact, it's become, bullying has become such an issue in the workplace, and certainly here, that it's really mustered finally like a system response, starting with the Office of the President, working its way to each campus and so on. So that's one of the things I'll be sharing with you today is kind of where that bullying piece fits into this larger picture of threat management. But the thing to understand again is that when these kind of behaviors arise in the workplace, and sometimes you can't tell, right? Sometimes you can't tell whether somebody really does pose a danger to others or if they're just obnoxious. Right? So there are some times when a judgment call needs to be made. And that's again where the threat management team comes in. So let's talk about where the threat management team gets its mandate from and how you all can interact with the team. So the threat management team has actually been in existence since 1995 here at UCSF. Many people are surprised to hear that. It came into existence not because of an incident that happened here, by the way, but for those of you whose memories go back this far, there was actually a very infamous workplace shooting at an office building on 101 California Street, where a disgruntled client came and shot up the law firm that he felt had poorly represented him. But that instigated, a move on the parts of many workplaces, including UCSF, to develop its own workplace violence policy and develop a team to deal with those kind of incidents. So, what kind of things would trigger a report to the threat management team? And you'll notice, and I'm speaking, of course, to people in the psychiatry department, that the behaviors that are addressed by the zero tolerance policy are just that, they're behaviors. If you read them, you'll see they make no real mention of motivation or intention, right? This isn't really about why somebody behaves the way they do, only the behavior itself. So, intimidation can include many different things. It can include behavior that creates a pattern in which people become afraid for their safety around this particular person. It can be a single incident in which somebody is so obviously angry, and in somebody's face that even if they don't touch them or make a verbal threat, a reasonable person would still be afraid for their safety. All right, so other than in this intimidation factor, all of the descriptions are purely behavioral. The intimidation one includes a cognitive piece, because again, there is this gray area where one person might find someone's behavior really obnoxious and distasteful, where somebody else might be truly afraid for their own safety. So that's that's something we often find ourselves in the middle of having to parse out. So if you are the recipient, the target of any of those behaviors, or if you witness them, you must report it. And this is a tricky thing, right? This is a sort of a bad news, good news deal when it comes to the zero tolerance policy. The bad news is you don't get to decide on your own whether a case needs to be evaluated by the threat management team. You must report it. The good news is you don't have to decide on your own, right? That this is something, that a special team that's highly trained, will review and assess. So the important thing, though, is that if you're in any kind of supervisory or director role, that even though you may feel like you've got good judgment about these things, even though you may be experienced in this, maybe you've got some special training, that's great. We're always welcome to have, some useful insight. But do not let it stop with you. That's one of the most critical takeaways here. If you're aware of this or someone brings it to your attention, you must report it on through to the threat management team. And I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, any questions about that? Okay. So, let's see. Okay. So who is on the team? So the core team, meaning that the members of the team who are involved in every case, are the police, legal affairs, FSAP, and risk management. And then risk can include either the campus and or the health system side. If it involves staff members, then labor and employee relations is involved. Beyond that, if the incident takes place on the premises of any of the health systems operations, including Langley Porter now, right? Then the medical center security would also be involved. If it involves grad students, we'd involve the graduate dean of students. If it involves faculty, we'd involve faculty academic affairs and so on. But this is what the core team is, and any member of the team can receive notification from you. The important thing to keep in mind, of course, is that if violence has already happened or it seems imminent, only call the police first. They will notify the rest of the team, right? But if it's that imminent, if it's that serious, go right to the police. Short of that, really a lot of it depends on the nature of the situation you're dealing with. If it's what if it's somebody's behavior who's like just suddenly become very bizarre? What if it's somebody whose performance has significantly dropped off and you're concerned that they may become emotionally volatile and overreactive, etc. There's any number of situations where you may want to consult about this. So you can always run concerns of a behavioral nature by the Langley Porter's own rapid response team, which we'll talk about later. You're always welcome to consult with me or my team on those kind of behavioral issues. Sometimes it might be risk management that gets the first call because there's concerns about a patient and whether a patient should be discharged from treatment, things like that. So any member of the team can receive the initial notification, but always make sure it's the police if violence has happened or it's imminent. Okay. So those initial notifications are really critical. If we don't find out about these cases, obviously we can't do anything about them. So having a robust notification system is really critical to any good threat management operation. Okay? And it's also part of the nature of the notification system that the people who are making these notifications are employees from and students from across the community, and who are not necessarily thinking of objective evidence gathering, right? They're thinking, oh my God, I'm afraid right now. Somebody is posing a danger to me, and so on. So one way to think about this, like from a colleague of mine who's one of the foremost writers and authorities in the threat management field, Dr. Reed Malloy. He draws the analogy to the nervous system, and so those of you who are into neuroscience, bear with me here. But think about the relationship of the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, right? So how does the amygdala react to possible danger. Come on. What's that?
Fight or flight.
Fight or flight, right? Right. Emergency, right? Danger, etc. So the amygdala is great for sounding the alarm, but is it great in terms of its ability to assess objectively whether there really is danger and what to do about it? Not so much. So Reed's analogy was that that the community serves as sort of the amygdala, right? That is noticing and responding to potential threats of danger and sending out the alarm. The threat management team serves as the prefrontal cortex. Right. Our job then is to take that information, and even though we need to respond quickly, it's not immediate. Right? We have time to digest the information, absorb it, think about it, assess before we come up with a plan of action. So I like that analogy because it creates that sense that there is it's not an either or. There's a dynamic. You all in your role as community members, not as clinicians, you might be the one to first notice if there's some danger. And by the way, 30% of our new cases are based on patients threatening staff, acting out, etc. And many of those come from the psychiatry department, particularly the citywide operation, out of San Francisco General, where they deal with some pretty rough folks. So, again, as reporters, as notifiers, we look to you to make sure that it comes to our attention if there is a situation. Right? We'll do the assessment and we'll get information from you and others, but it's not up to you to make that final call. So after we've gotten those notifications, we make an initial assessment based on the information we have, but there is continual investigation going on. That's part of the threat management process, is that it is ongoing, it's dynamic, and it adjusts as new information comes in. I can't tell you how many cases we've had where, based on the first information we got, we thought, well, this is no big deal, this is just somebody having a bad day. More information comes in, it's sounding worse and worse. Before you know it, this guy has 12 guns at home. Before you know it, he's got a history of convictions for violent behavior, and he's stalked someone before and they had to get a restraining order against him. So new information is always coming in, and the threat assessment is ongoing and dynamic.
And let me just say something.
Yeah.
So, a lot of us do violence risk assessment, history of violence, do they have weapons, do they have a plan? What Andrew was saying, I just want to emphasize it, if you go to the threat management team, the police are involved. And so they can go into their records and they can say, has this person ever been arrested? Have they been convicted? It's things we would never know about as clinicians in terms of doing violence risk assessments.
And do they have weapons registered?
Do they have through when you buy a weapon legally, it's listed in the Department of Justice database. Do they have weapons? Not what they're telling us, but do they actually have it? So you really can do a much better assessment.
And we've had a number of cases, in fact, where people didn't just have a weapon or two, but had like a whole armory of weapons, as it turned out. In cases where, because of mental illness, they really shouldn't have had any. So again, that's something that we always need to check, and that's one thing I would also say is that part of our protocol is that when we get a case like this, we are looking to determine whether or not this person poses any kind of danger, but especially an imminent one. And so the more information that we can get, the better. And one of the requirements that we make is that if somebody wants to report a case, they must be willing to make a police report. If they're not, why wouldn't they? Right? But a police report gives our police department the information they need to get an investigation going, to do that background check that Renee was just talking about, to check for weapons and so on. Without that police report, one, we don't have all the information available, and two, the police can't do their part. So that's one thing, sometimes people will suddenly become reluctant to go that far. They'll just want somebody else to handle it. But no, if they're raising a concern about their own safety, they must be willing to go at least that extra step. And I should say, our police are very well trained in doing these interviews and taking these reports. They are not heavy-handed. They're much more familiar with dealing with people in distress than the average police department. So, people really should have no fear, of having those kind of interactions. Now, even when the team is met, the resolution is sort of a tricky concept in threat assessment, because even after an initial case has been discussed and a plan of action has been agreed on, there may be ongoing monitoring. It all depends on the situation. There may be things going on for months afterwards. So, resolution is kind of a slippery idea when it comes to threat management. Sometimes cases just eventually, fall off the radar, but they can fall right back on. The fact is that for every case that the threat management team as a whole meets on to discuss, there are probably 10 that some subset of us are assessing and reviewing. There's no week of the year in which the team is not assessing new cases. Right? I have like 4 open ones right now myself. So even when we're not actually meeting the full team to address the case, there's a lot of action going on still, behind the scenes. So as we're wrapping up the case and we're looking at the things that need to be done, that can be done, these are some of the tools that we have available that you should be aware of. So of course, if this involves employees, faculty or staff, or students, there may be appropriate disciplinary actions that need to be taken based on behavior, even up to and including dismissal. Sometimes people may be put on administrative or investigatory leave. Those are paid but involuntary leaves. If we need to get somebody out of the workplace while we investigate, for example. Sometimes when it involves patients, there may be a decision to deny treatment. Now, the risk management team goes very far in trying to make sure that no patient is discharged without a plan, and so on. But that is sometimes the only option available. If somebody is poses such a danger, here that we cannot save the people.
I have a question on that point.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's a risky situation in my mind. Is there then a vigilance about that person showing back up?
Mm-hmm. Right. So anytime we have a case where we have someone who, and this kind of goes to the EPOs and TROs, restraining orders, anytime we have a case where somebody has been temporarily or permanently banned from campus, we may have what's called a workplace violence restraining order in place. If we know where they're likely to show up, we will have their photo with the front desk security guards, things like that. Plus, maybe like a bulletin that will go out notifying everyone to be on the lookout for a particular person. So yeah, that does happen, and we do have to make sure, because people, as we all know, restraining orders are pieces of paper. Right? They exist in a legal universe, and I'm not saying they have no value. In fact, you and Chris Benitez did a paper a while back on do protective orders protect?
Right.
What was the basic conclusion?
It depends. I think the good thing about the protective order is that as individuals, we don't go to court, where the person knows that we got it. It's the whole campus, who has the restraining order from UCSF rather than any of us individually. Because people then can get very angry at us.
So one way to think about it is that even though a determined person is not going to let a restraining order stop them, it does create a legal tripwire. As soon as they come, once the order is in place, they've committed a crime, and that we can act on. So we certainly don't want it to come to that, but that's when we employ restraining orders, it's with that view in mind, which is no, this isn't by itself going to stop the person, but at least it creates that legal barrier that we can then act on. Any questions about that? So the police can issue emergency protective orders on their own say-so. Temporary restraining orders, there's a fairly low threshold for them. There is a restraining orders clinic in town to help people who don't have access to legal help, victims of domestic violence, things like that. But once that restraining order has been issued, then we make sure the police have a copy of it, and we can be on the lookout for that person. Okay, but keep in mind that to make a temporary restraining order permanent, you have to go to a hearing. The other person can show up, they often do, especially in stalking cases, which won't surprise you. And in those cases, then we'll make sure that we have the care advocate, with our person, that we have police escort if need be, to make sure that they feel safe being there in the courtroom. That's often where some of this drama gets played out. Okay. And even, let's be clear that even a so-called permanent restraining order is really typically about 3 to 5 years, right? So permanent is really not as permanent as it sounds, and there's often the need to get it renewed. There are also options. One thing I should mention, is that if a particular person is targeted and their office setup is one that makes them feel particularly vulnerable, the police department security team has an excellent service where they come and do an on-site security analysis. They will actually look at the entire workspace from top to bottom, how vulnerable it is, points of access, and make recommendations how to make it more secure. Could include everything from moving somebody to setting up panic buttons, peepholes, things like that, blocking doors that are typically left open. There's any number of things they might recommend in order to make a workspace more secure. So, one of the things I want to stress about threat management is that it is a very different kind of discipline than we usually think of when we think of like law enforcement, or when we think of even forensic psychiatry. Because often with threat management, there's no actual crime. Might be a threat of a crime, might be maybe a misdemeanor or something like that. But oftentimes with threat assessment, you're not actually dealing with something where the police can just go arrest somebody. I'll give you a good example. How many of you know about the deficiencies in California's stalking law? Right? That in California, in order for someone to be convicted of stalking, in addition to pursuing somebody unwantedly, they must also pose a credible threat of violence. Right? Now, the fact is that a great majority of stalking cases do not involve threats. Certainly not explicit ones. Right? But nevertheless, the person may feel very legitimately afraid for their safety. So there's an example where sometimes we have to take into account the fact that that just because someone is in a situation that doesn't trigger a criminal action, right, a criminal violation, that doesn't mean that they're not in danger. It doesn't mean that something doesn't need to be done to protect them. As I mentioned before, assessment is dynamic and ongoing. There's often a need for long-term protection. So the thing that I want to stress about this also is that in threat assessment, there really are no profiles. There really are no, there's no model or no predictive model. I mean, as Renee and others can tell you, sure, past behavior is usually one of the most reliable predictors of future behavior. But beyond that very general principle, the fact is that very often you don't have like a simple predictive model and say, this is the kind of person who's most likely to do X or Y. And that gets into a distinction that Renee made earlier between risk assessment and threat assessment. Right? Not the same thing, although they're often used as if they were synonymous. So in risk assessment, you have a person, situation, and you're asking, what could this lead to? How likely is it that this person will at some point act out, cause harm, etc.? How volatile is the situation, etc. But you're not thinking of it in terms of a particular target or individual or group. You're asking, does this, let's say this patient pose a risk? Might they act out? Whereas threat assessment, as Renee said, is really about a situation in which there is a target. This person intends harm to a person or a group of people, and we have to assess how seriously do they intend that, what needs to be done to prevent it, and so on. How can we intervene? Oops. There we go. So any questions about that distinction? It's fairly straightforward once it's laid out, but I want to make sure you're all clear about it. Okay. So one of the things that we're always dealing with in the threat assessment field is what kind of case are we dealing with here? Is this something where somebody really does pose a danger, or are they just venting? Is this somebody who made a threat like, I'm going to murder him, the way people will sometimes vent, or I'm going to murder that guy, where you can qualitatively say that sounds a little different. So we're always having to make those kind of assessments. And very often it's a false alarm. Very often it's somebody just venting. Very often it's somebody who's a bully, but not to the point where anybody's physical safety is at risk. Right? So those kind of distinctions are just a natural part of the threat assessment process. And we're always looking at those kind of questions. Now, as I said, there really is no predictive algorithm that you can just plug, certain set of facts into and say this person is or is not going to commit violence. But there is a lot of information that we can draw on about, who is more likely than not to act out. When people make threats, how seriously should we take them? Are there some people who make threats just to get a rise out of others? Other people who make threats because they're really serious about it, and so on. So that's something that we're always in the process of assessing is this person's behavior, is what they're saying, how they're saying it really indicative of someone who's likely to act out or not? So one of the distinctions I like, partly just because I think it's very colorful, is a distinction that Frederick or Ted Calhoun makes between what he calls hunters and howlers. So a hunter is somebody who really is planning to hurt someone. They intend it, they make a plan, and they try to carry it out. Howlers are people who voice threats, who express their anger and their resentments and so on, right and left, but do not, and in fact rarely actually carry out those threats. So it's a constant process, right? Because on the one hand, you can't just say, oh, he's just a hunter, we're just going to ignore him. I mean, a howler, we're just going to ignore him, right? He might just be the one who's going to actually act it out. On the other hand, hunters rarely howl. Hunters rarely advertise that they are planning to harm someone, right? And so in those cases, you don't just have a simple matter of like, okay, this person utters a threat, let's see if it's real. In the case of a real hunter, which thankfully happens very rarely around here, I might say, but in those cases, we have to find other ways of getting into, getting information about what they're up to, because they don't tend to advertise it. Now, the one exception that's very important to stress when it comes to howling, to voicing threats, is most of the time those threats do not amount to much. And the more remote the relationship is, like say towards a public figure, the less likely somebody is to act out on those kind of threats. However, there is this intimacy effect. The closer the relationship the person who's making the threat has to the threatened person, the more likely they might actually be to carry that out. That's why domestic violence cases are so critical. The threat management team here at UCF, we actually made a policy decision some years ago to regard all domestic violence cases as potential threat cases. About 10 to 15% of those cases spill over into the workplace. The abuser knows where the victim works. Maybe they've even been there before. They just don't know how to find them. And if they do come looking for their victim in the workplace, what is likely to happen?
Collateral damage.
You got it, right? All it takes is one well-intentioned, coworker to try to get in the way of this person, or who knows what it might be, or if they come, with a gun. So that's one of the things that we take very seriously here. Not only domestic violence in general, but the potential for domestic violence cases to spill over into the workplace and bring violence with them. So that's something. So whether you're dealing with a patient or an employee here in the department, if you get the sense that this person is the victim of domestic violence, these are questions I want you to start asking yourself. Right? Is it really, is this domestic violence? Can I find out for sure? And if so, what do I do about this? First you want to get that person to get some help, maybe send them to FSAP or somewhere else where they can get support. But there's also the question of how dangerous is this situation that they're involved in. Right.
What are some questions you would ask the patient?
What's that now?
What are some questions you would ask the patient?
Well, of course, a lot of it depends. I mean, if it's a patient where, there's more of a basis to be questioning them about a variety of things, sometimes if you see the bruises, if you see the other kind of physical signs, you might just come right out and say, it looks like, someone's harmed you. If it's not a patient where there isn't that kind of open access to questions, it's more tricky. If it's a coworker, let's say, you notice that they're coming into work, with their, long sleeve shirts on and sunglasses on a hot day, things like that. You notice that they've got a black eye, and so on. That they're showing up late for work. All those kind of warning signs, it's to tell you something is amiss at home. In those cases, it's harder because if the person doesn't volunteer it, you can kind of open the door, but you can't go through it yourself. You have to say, is something happening? I'm worried about you. Anything you can share with me that you're willing to talk about. Or if not me, maybe somebody you can speak to confidentially. But please, don't do nothing about this.
I'm wondering, in the case of the patient, what questions you ask to then decide whether to report to threat management?
I would say, has he or she threatened you recently? What threats have they made? Do you know for a fact that they already know where you work? Or have they even been to your workplace? Things like that. What is your workplace like? I mean, if it's here, you might know more about it, but if it's somewhere else, how secure is it? Is there a front desk? Can people just walk right in or not? So those are all the kind of questions that would come to my mind. How long has this been going on? And of course, there's always the perennial concern, which is, that when somebody is getting ready to leave an abusive relationship, that's often when it's most dangerous. And so finding that out, is this somebody who's actually, had enough and they're thinking about leaving? If so, have they got a safety plan? Have they, if they talk to somebody, about a place to stay, things like that. So those are all the questions that would be on my checklist. Okay. Other questions along those lines? Okay. So again, keep in mind that if you're dealing with domestic violence, if you're dealing with a stalking case, those are the kind, you take all threats seriously, but those are the threats I would give more weight to, right? If you're dealing with one of those kind of cases where there's an intimacy factor, and again, most stalking cases are former intimates who have been rejected, right? So there's often that kind of dynamic going on there too. Now, another very key distinction to make in understanding threats and threat assessment is the distinction between two different kinds of violence. Okay. All right. I want you to imagine your typical house cat, right? First scenario, all out of the blue, a dog shows up and lunges at the cat. What does the cat do? Arches its back, right? Piloerection, the whole thing, right? It's like it's ready for a fight, right? That's affective, right? That is impromptu, right? That cat is just suddenly out of nowhere getting ready for a fight. Now imagine that same cat in the backyard stalking a little bird. What's it like? Is its heart racing? No. Right. Is it making noise? No. It's silent and focused. That's predatory violence. Right? Just to give you kind of a rough way of thinking about the two. So different authors use different pairs of terms for these: intended versus impromptu violence, predatory versus effective, targeted versus reactive, and so on. But you get the feeling for it, right? So the truth is that the great majority of the cases that we deal with here at UCSF, thankfully, are of the more impromptu kind. People having a bad day, people losing their temper, people, trying to pick a fight in the heat of the moment, things like that. Those are still serious and they can still lead to real harm, so I don't mean to minimize them. But those are the more common kind of cases. The much more difficult kind of cases, the ones that we really have to make a full court press on, are the ones where we think that somebody might be intending violence, might be planning it, right? Because again, these people are hunters. These people do not tend to advertise their intentions. They don't howl that much, if at all. So in those kind of cases, you have to find out what they're up to by other means. So if there are no profiles, and there aren't, if there is no predictive algorithm, what can you go by? How can you tell what somebody is up to and if they really pose a danger? So what we have learned through a great deal of observation, analysis, and research is that while people do not fit profiles, they do follow a certain path to violence. And when they do, it becomes possible, depending on where on that path they are, to assess what they're up to. Okay. At the beginning of this path, there's always some kind of grievance. Right? This person is mad at so-and-so for this or that. This person is resentful about such and such. This person feels they've been done wrong to. They feel that they've been that their email has been hacked, that this person has, damaged their reputation. It could be any number of things. But it always begins with a grievance, and usually one that's very intensely felt. Okay. But as we know, a great many people, the great majority of people have grievances, including very strong ones, and never go any further than that, right? So what is that critical next step that we look for to say that somebody might be crossing that line, might be actually, really on this path? And that's the ideation piece. That is, we begin to get indications that this person is thinking, is believing that violence is the answer to their grievance. Maybe the only answer. But that's the danger, right? When somebody starts thinking along those lines, I'm not going to just sue, I'm not going to go to the press, I'm not going to make a formal complaint through my union, or whatever the avenues might be, they start thinking violence. That's the answer. When that happens, then you got to watch out. Because as soon as somebody starts thinking that way, other things begin to become noticeable. They might start speaking more approvingly of people who commit workplace violence. They might start talking about about fascination with guns and so on. And this is not about guns per se. This is about the fascination with guns that sometimes for some people can become very unhealthy. So there are any number of signs that begin to show that this person is starting to move down that path. And this brings up a very key concept, in the threat assessment field, which is that even though people don't advertise their intentions, hunters don't typically howl, they do leak. Right? They leak in all sorts of ways. They'll leak online in social media. They'll leak to a friend. They'll say something that that friend just cannot get over because it was so strange or so out of place. They'll start engaging in what are sometimes known as last acts. Right? They'll start giving away treasured items. The Major Nadal, the man who shot up the Fort Hood military base, in the days prior to the attack, he began doing all sorts of things that, in retrospect, were like clear last act signs. He was, he was paying off all his bills. He was wrapping up his affairs. He gave away his favorite Quran to a neighbor. Things like that. Things that nobody does, who's planning to be around. So it's that kind of leakage that really requires, close attention, and that's where, having a trained eye makes such a difference. So back to our notification system, we don't expect you necessarily, as potential notifiers, to see all these things, right? But any that you might become aware of. Hey, I was looking at this person's online posting, and they had a photo with 10 different guns in it, or something. You never know what it might be. But again, those are the things that might be the tip of some iceberg. And that's where, again, we look to all of you to be our amygdala, and to notice and respond rapidly to those things and bring them to the attention of somebody who can make an assessment. So, you could spend an entire day on this path to violence concept. I just wanted you to get the visuals and get a sense that there is a progression there. And anywhere along the way, right up until the very last, it's still possible to intervene, right? If you know what's going on. And that's, sometimes where we have, it's really just been sometimes, honestly, dumb luck. We had a case not that long ago involving a former patient, an oncology patient, who lived in the Central Valley and felt that his various oncology docs here and elsewhere had not done a good job. In fact, that he was felt he was going to die because of it. He was very mad, and he didn't send any threatening letters. He didn't do anything like that. He did have quite a collection of guns, but his wife got concerned about it. He was behaving oddly. He was talking, kind of grumbling about these doctors and something needed to be done about them. Just enough that she called the local police. And they came to the house, they did a search, they saw that 2 of his guns were missing. And then they found the letter that he wrote with a list of the 5 doctors that he was going to kill before he took himself out. And we caught him on the freeway in the bay, somewhere near Redwood City, because we were able to do a low jack on his car. But that was like, you get the feeling for that, right? I mean, here's somebody who he made his intended plan. He was targeting people. He had loaded guns in his car when they stopped him and arrested him, and he had his list with him. And there were 2 people here, one at Stanford. I forget what the other 2 were. Right? So, thank God for leaks, and for someone, and it's rare that a family member will be the one to notify, but thank God that she did. There's no telling what could have happened if we hadn't gotten a clue what he was up to in time to intervene. Questions about all that? Okay, we're running short on time here. Okay, a little bit about resources that are available to you. So there's a wide variety of resources available for different parts of this whole situation. So let me first ask Dr. Binder and Dominic to talk about the Langley Porter's own rapid response team and what kind of situations you should be called upon for.
Yeah. So the rapid response team here is...
How many people know about the rapid response team here?
From a medical standpoint?
Any kind of, you're worried about something. Yeah, I don't mean that someone collapses and you call a code blue, but you're worried about, they're going to kill themselves, or they're going to hurt someone else, or,
From a psychiatric standpoint? No.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the medical center uses the term rapid response as part of their code blue, so we're not talking about that at all. We're talking about, it's primarily used for patient care, where it's often a patient with a fair amount of complexity clinically, and with that, a lot of acuity and high risk. And often the team that initiates it is the team that's taking care of the patient. And we usually, and it's called rapid, we try to pull it together within a few days. Usually Dr. Bender chairs this, and we often bring in other folks throughout the building to just help enrich the conversation. We usually meet for about an hour to try to just have more than just a wide set of eyes on the case and on the discussion, and to try to figure out some strategies both clinically and as well perhaps things beyond just the clinical care. Parker's joined it as well, from the standpoint of, do we activate threat management team, things like that. So this is sort of variably known as a resource, but it's important for everyone to be aware that this is available. And usually people contact me as a point person to help kind of get it together. But often people will contact Dr. Bender, Dr. Chamberlain, and people in the forensic psychiatry area as well.
Renee, anything to add to that?
No, that's great.
So in addition to that, and other things that, again, resources to think about. So if something has happened that was particularly upsetting to one or more of your folks, then that's, again, where FSAP can help out. We provide, of course, a great deal of individual counseling and support, but we also do critical incident debriefing groups. If it's been a bunch of people who've been affected by something like this. In the run-up, when maybe you've got two people whose relationship is starting to become very conflicted and problematic, but hasn't yet turned ugly, hasn't yet turned to the point where fighting words are uttered, things like that. That's a good time to involve the ombuds office. Sometimes it's possible to diffuse a situation before it gets that far. Sometimes the particular form that the behavior is taking is one of harassment, bullying, stalking. In those cases, we always encourage that you notify the officer for the prevention of harassment and discrimination. Of course, UCPD, anytime that there is anything that you feel like rises to the level of a threat, anytime that a report needs to be made, of course, as I've talked about before. If it's in the building or any of the premises, where patients are seen, there's always, of course, medical center security. They should be notified. Often they're much more readily available because they're on site than to the police officer. The police can often be here within 5 to 10 minutes. But security often is right there when you need them. Risk management. If you're dealing with a situation where you might need to consider discharging the patient from treatment because they're just too dangerous or too unruly to treat at this level of care. That's where, again, risk management can come in very handily. And then finally, if you're having to consider a situation, say, of a workplace violence restraining order or anything like that, that's, again, where our Office of Legal Affairs can come into play. And again, the legal affairs, police department, risk management, FSAP are all members of the threat management team. But we also wear our other hats. Okay, and I include some sources here that I think you're going to make this available as a handout for people, so you should have all that in there. So we have a little bit of time left for Q&A. Anything I haven't covered, anything that deserves some more attention, some more questions about?
I think for clinicians, I can see, you mentioned this reticence to file a police report when in their judgment it may not fall into the strict categories where you can violate confidentiality, such as a threat to self or others or things like that, grave disability, child abuse, neglect, adult abuse, etc. And I'm assuming you will try to help walk people through that a little bit if they're kind of not sure. But anything else you might add to it?
Yeah, one thing, Don, is that to keep in mind is that when we ask people to make a police report, that's not the same as filing charges. And sometimes people mistakenly thinking that it's the same thing, that's where their reticence comes from. But this is an informational report. If in fact the police deem a crime is committed, then they will also take that next step. But initially and very often the report is really just informational. So it establishes, a set of facts that the police can then base their investigations on, do the background check on, things like that. So whether it's the clinician being reticent or the patient or employee being reticent about that, that can often reassure them that, it doesn't mean that they're like filing charges against someone. It's a separate matter.
Do they meet the individual in person or via phone? Is the interview conducted over the phone or in person?
They try to do them as much as possible in person. Sometimes, if a person, like say, lives fairly far away and they're taking some leave time or something like that, they will do it by phone rather than wait. But they prefer to do it in person.
Just the other thing that I never knew about is that, if people live close to campus, but it's an incident, so there was an issue with some animal researchers, some years ago, people worried about bombs, it was, in those phase. And the police actually went to people's homes, checked the security and just gave them all kinds of advice about what they could do. So
Right.
it's helpful to know about.
That goes back to the point I made earlier about one of the services that our police department has, which is the security analysis, where they will come into a workplace, but they will also come to a person's home if they've been threatened at home, and do a security analysis of the premises, make sure it's secure. If not, they'll make recommendations to make it more so. Time for one or two more? So the thing I really want to emphasize then is that the threat management team here at UCSF has been around for a long time. We have a pretty well-oiled operation here, but we are always learning. We're always, trying to upgrade. We are certainly always open to feedback about how we do, but especially we are open to getting notification from you all if there's anything that you think might need our attention. When in doubt, consult. One last thing I'll mention, talked about the zero tolerance policy, is that we are actually now in the process of revising the policy. It hasn't been revised in quite a while to include bullying. And of course, nonviolent bullying will still be dealt with separately, but there's so many more cases of it these days that from the Office of the President on down, each campus is being asked to come up with a policy for how to address this. What we're going to do here, which some other campuses have done, is to actually expand our zero tolerance policy on workplace violence to include bullying. Yeah.
I know one of the other areas that people have been talking about expanding policies around trafficking. I wonder, would that fall into this at all, do you think?
Well, of course, it would depend on how it might impinge on our community here. Basically the policy exists to protect members of our community. So faculty, staff, students, trainees, volunteers, anybody who, we think of as being a member of this community.
Okay, so just for that professional side.
That's right.
Okay.
So that certainly is a big topic, I'm sad to say. And it gets a lot of talk, at the annual meeting of the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, which I belong to, and Dr. Binder does too. That's a topic that comes up a lot these days, that, lone wolf terrorists, all sorts of things like that. But those are things that thankfully we don't have to deal with here so much. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you all.
Thank you.